Welcome to IGN Unfiltered, our monthly interview show where we sit down with the very best and brightest of the video game industry. My name is Ryan McCaffrey. This man you probably know, Cliff Bleszinski.
God, he just turned that on Seacrest style. He's like, "What's up?" I'm like, I gotta wake up now. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, you can bring their A game here, Cliff.
More caffeine or something. How you doing, man? It's good to see you.
I'm great. It's good to see you. I've known you now for over a decade. You've been making games for much longer than that.
I took a little time off, but yeah.
Yeah, and we'll get to that, believe me.
Okay.
But I wanted to kind of just start with sort of general question. You know you've done well for yourself when the top two Google autocomplete results for you are Cliff Bleszinski wife and Cliff Bleszinski net worth.
Oh, I thought it was gonna be like talker,
No,
late night
not at all.
drunk tweets.
So just general off the top, like how do you get to the point you are? You started making games when you were a kid, which we'll talk more about, and now here you are. You're running your own startup, new successful game studio. You've engineered multiple huge IPs. Is it luck? Is it hard work? What is the Cliff Bleszinski secret?
The current state, and if you get me to talk about myself in third person, I'll stab you. The current state of where I am
That'd make for good TV.
is kind of like starting over in a lot of ways. Because what you see now, and we alluded to this in the hallway, talking about the generation of MOBAs, the generation of Minecraft, and the Twitch and YouTube generation, which is the new MTV. This whole generation of 8 to whatever demographic we want to label right now doesn't know who I am, nor do they give a right? At the end of the day, so I'm reintroducing, myself and the kind of studio that I have, the kind of game that I'm making to that audience, right?
Yeah.
Your 28 to 50-year-olds who grew up, playing the things that I've made, they know who I am. So for me, as much as I do come across as brash and cocky sometimes, I really do have this kind of deep sense of humility and I hope people will try the new game and really give it an honest to God go and see that, I make this stuff I want to play. And, we're at the studio laughing and playing it every day.
Yeah.
And, our publishers getting their ducks in a row in regards to marketing the hell out of it. And it's coming out sooner than you think. It's been a lot of
the
fun.
game is Lawbreakers. It's a brand new game. We'll talk more about that too. The studio is Boss Key. You took some time off. We'll get to all that. First, I want to back up. You were in the first issue of Nintendo Power magazine. Yep. What I want to know about that is, you've talked about that before, but how did you find out? Like, because they don't contact you ahead of time, right? You just get the magazine, right?
Remember, this was like in the 80s, right?
This
is 41 people.
It was 89, I think.
89-ish,
somewhere
but
right
I was
around.
actually, Nintendo had this fanzine that they did before called Nintendo Fun Club, which I still
I remember that too. I think I was in that.
Zelda, Duck Hunt, Punch Out, all of those were in that. And my friend Ralph Barbagallo, who's a VR developer now, by the way, he was actually at Ion Storm as well. He was my childhood best friend. He and I used to have sleepovers and play Genesis games and Nintendo games together.
Yeah.
And we sent in literally a Polaroid of the high score to Nintendo, and this is when the Fun Club was around. I don't even know how.
And you would literally mail it.
Yeah,
of
you
course.
literally mailed the meat space envelope, right? You couldn't just send a selfie or anything. And it was one of those things that when the issue showed up and my name was at the top of the list, not because I was cool, but because of alphabetical order. And of course, my name was misspelled, which is a series of the rest of my life dealing with that, which is
McCaffrey,
fine.
I can relate. So believe me.
Yeah, like Anne McCaffrey, what? And so then I just sent in a few more, and then suddenly the first issue of Nintendo Power came, which I waited for with bated breath for months, like checking the mailbox every freaking day that hot New England summer. And when it finally showed up, and same thing with the Zelda manual, I could smell it, and just the Mario on the cover, and that kind of clay look to it all.
Mario 2, yeah.
Mario 2, which was really not really Mario 2, which was really Dream World out of Japan, because Mario 2 was deemed too difficult for Western audiences, which is I talk crap about Nintendo because I've always cared about Nintendo. And so games, they're in my blood, they're in my DNA. And I just, ever since I saw that you can manipulate an image on a TV or monitor, I was hooked from that point out.
So you realized that you wanted to make games pretty early then?
I knew at the age of 6 when I saw Space Invaders. And it's like that. A brief period when I wanted to act, and then a brief period when I wanted to be a herpetologist, which is, of course, the study of reptiles and amphibians, because I caught snakes and stuff. I was a weird kid. But then, ultimately coming back to games, and, my family was fortunate enough, being from a middle-class family, to afford an Apple IIc at the time. And then it was originally for my older brother, Tyler, founder of Vox Media.
Yep.
And he ignored it because he was at an age where he was too busy chasing all the girls in the neighborhood. And I was just like, okay. and I started programming and just learning BASIC because I wasn't smart enough to learn Pascal or C++ or anything like that. Finding adventure construction sets and things like that, and made a game that was a little adventure game I brought to my freshman year of high school teacher and sold it to him in a plastic bag for $20.
Yeah, the game was called The Palace of Deceit.
This is even before that.
Oh, even before that.
This is when Manuel Noriega was being hunted down by our government at the time. I can't remember who the president was at the time, but it was where in Panama was Manuel Noriega.
Would have been probably the first Bush,
I think it was first Bush, yeah. And I knew very little of the news. This was before the internet, and I had to kind of just like guess what Panama would be like and how you could find Manuel Noriega. I was a weird kid. I read Time magazine, and then eventually got on to doing Palace of Deceit and the adventure game. So once I wound up with my IBM 386SX.
Well, tell me about that game. So yeah, the Palace of Deceit, Dragon's Plight. I had to cheat on my notes for that one. But you were 17 when you made that game. What did you learn from that experience?
I learned a lot about usability. Well, first off, okay, to back up a little bit, for me it was about IP creation. And, I've always loved dragons. Even way before Game of Thrones and all that. I just thought dragons were really, really cool creatures, and the mythology of it was very fascinating. And so the idea is you were a young dragon who was imprisoned by this evil wizard, and you had to escape this castle and meet all these wacky characters that I drew all the cheesy artwork for and my goofy little writing. But it was kind of the deja vu, uninvited snatcher type of adventure game. And that was sold on 3.5-inch floppies that literally selling copies out of my mom's old house in Southern California. And I put out a demo version and people would register it with shareware, and I'd get a check in the mail, and I'd the first few orders.
Box it up, right?
The first few orders, what I did was so I didn't want to write 001. Right, so I put a bunch of numbers in front to make it look like some sort of magical serial number, and then did 001, so to act like some sort of big company, and then would just manually mail it out to people. I usually once a week I go down to the post office, and it's like a rapper selling his mixtape out of his trunk or something, but the white suburban version of that, I guess.
Now, do you think if we get into the psychology of that, it's about a dragon who's imprisoned? Are you the dragon? Were you trying to break free from your suburban confines?
I was a lonely, pimply-faced kid. Of course I was, right?
We all were.
But the one thing, still get pimples at 41. The one saving grace besides my nerddom was getting involved in drama. And that's one of the things we were talking about. You have a daughter, my brother, my nieces and nephews. I'm just like, even if they don't become an actor, or actress, model, anything like that, just to put them together with a band of what are usually a bunch of awesome misfits in drama club, and to work towards a goal. And to figure out how to almost be a family in a limited time period, then perform in front of a crowd just for confidence alone, it's awesome. And so that's why I suggest to everybody, sports are great too, activities are great, but for me...
Support the liberal arts.
Yeah, drama, man, that's where it's at. So anyway, and then, so I made that game, and then moved on to my next once, this was the shareware era of CompuServe and BBSs and whatnot. And this is when Epic Games came rip-roaring on the scene.
I want to ask you real quick, do you still have a copy of Dragon's Deceit?
Yeah, no, it's Dragon's Plight.
Sorry,
the dragon was the one in trouble. He wasn't. He made it sound like some sort of like weird Japanese.
I apologize.
The Panzer Dragoon type game. Dragon's Deceit.
That's a good title, though. You should run with that.
That's actually not bad. And so it's a dragon that can go stealth, and he's in a MOBA, and he shoots fire out his butt. So yeah, I have it framed in my home. I have the original 3.5-inch floppies, and I had found a bunch of the artwork that I had printed and framed, and then a lot of my development log notes, which are like all in a frame. I've managed to I somehow kept on a bunch of my old from that time period. So some of it I hadn't looked at in 15 years. And like a couple weekends ago, Lauren and I just chilled out, nursed champagne, and went through all my old photos, and just crazy weird time periods throughout my life.
Do we know where disc 001 is?
No, we don't.
No, it never turned up. Huh?
For years later, though, I'd already moved on, and my mom was still occasionally getting a check in the mail and had to send it back. And I think that was the time when my mom's like, there could really be something to this whole video game thing, and because I'd read the stories about how Apple started in the garage, and how all these tech companies, even Tim Sweeney at Epic, he started in his parents' basement. And capitalism, can be a very bad thing, but sometimes there's certain aspects of a free market that can be good, that can allow someone to kind of make a product and see if it rises or sinks.
Right. So you're from Massachusetts, but you went to high school in Southern California, as you mentioned, and you sent a copy of Dragon's Plight to Tim Sweeney at Epic.
Yeah, this was right around Jill of the Jungle time period.
Right. Why Epic? Why'd you send it to them?
I liked their attitude. And this was also the time when most of the publishers, your LucasArts, your EAs,
Sierra.
Sierra, they were a walled garden. And you couldn't send anything to them because legal reasons.
Right.
Still to this day, if somebody emails me a game idea, I can't read it, and I don't. And I'm like, dude, I can't, because if I happen to make something somewhat similar, you're going to come after me and try and sue me. And I'd rather focus time on making a video game rather than dealing with lawyers. And so it's one of those things that, Epic was available and wanted to almost be a publisher at that time. And basically deal with okay, well, make sure your game gets on all these servers, all these BBSs, and we'll kind of, help make physical copies that are mailed out, a manual and all that, and be essentially your publisher at the time. And, I sent it to Tim and Mark, and I was expecting, Tim Sweeney to call me, the brains behind the operation. Instead, he sent this boisterous, loud named Mark Rain to call me. I say it because Mark,
you know him very well.
Mark's he was at both of my weddings, and he's a dear friend, and he's and he knows it, and he wears it on his sleeve, and he's good at it, and it helps him be very, very good at his job and being pushy and consistent, persistent, and insistent, and that's why he's Mark. And Mark called me, a very young me. I was like 18, 19 at the time, and you have to understand emotionally, I was still very much like 14. I'm like 41, but I'm going on like 25 right now emotionally. And he's like, hey, okay, so we're gonna take your game, we're gonna redo all the graphics and like high resolution, then we're gonna hire blah, blah, blah. I'm just sitting there going like, who the hell is this guy? I wanted to talk to the nerdy dude, like
right.
What the hell? And but that's kind of the pairing that you've seen throughout tech of like the kind of brainy genius.
The Wozniak and the Jobs.
Yeah,
right?
the Carmack and Ramiro, and for me that's, me being the creative, having Ardian who's, running Boss Key, who's the one who came from a code background that I later did Jazz Jackrabbit with. So those kinds of pairings generally tend to yield a good thing, right?
You complement each other.
Exactly. Can call each other out in each other's and figure out what area a person isn't the best in, and the other person fills in the gap, and it winds up being some Master Blaster type.
So Tim Sweeney hires you.
It's technically a contractor. A contract developer. Yeah.
So, but you're hired to work at a video game company at this point. So, what's your reaction at that point?
Well, I mean, I was at the point where I was making a little bit of money, but I wasn't making enough to move out of my mother's house, or get my own first car, or get an apartment where I could actually run air conditioning, because my mother wouldn't run air conditioning in inland Southern California. It's weird. and so I was really working away on my next game because, so first I made Palace of Deceit. That made a little bit of money, did fairly well. Then I made this really bizarre game called Dare to Dream, into which you're like a 10-year-old.
Another adventure game.
Yeah, another adventure game, but it was this really esoteric thing where you're like a 10-year-old boy dealing with this evil character that was a metaphor for my Catholic guilt being raised. It was really, really weird.
Right.
And I was going through a very weird hormonal phase.
But adventure games, you got to remember, were the it genre at that point in time.
I think it was,
in
hindsight,
right?
man, it might have been that I was on that anti-acne drug Accutane at the time, which could really affect.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah, I still used to use
Dries you
chapstick.
out, yeah, it's unreal.
Especially on the West Coast, I'm just like, still to this day, can I get some Jergens up in here? I'm just getting a little ashy.
I don't sweat anymore, it's strange.
Yeah, my feet get really sweaty though. So, okay, we're getting super nerd.
Off topic.
And but I think that's why that game went up so weird, but the thing is the game was meant to be kind of a super esoteric puzzle experience, kind of like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the whole idea of getting the Babblefish. And I kind of took that idea and ran with it, which meant nobody could get through the damn game because it made absolutely no sense. Like you had to find Vaseline to lubricate a sewer grate to slide down and pick the lock with the tail of a fish. It was like, what? And it was just really...
Ron Gilbert would approve.
Like, I mean, his games made sense. Like, you could play through them. This game was just dumb. I don't know what I was thinking. I made a whole trilogy of it. I did all the graphics, worked my butt off. It came out and just face planted. And I was like... And then Tim sends me this little demo that looked like the old game Turrican, the Amiga game, where it was kind of this, 60 frames a second type, super smooth scrolling on PC, which no one had seen at that point.
Right.
We'd had up to that point, just like Commander Keen and whatnot by id, and this was before the era of Doom, of course.
Yeah.
And it came with this little level editor, and I had, Deluxe Paint on my computer at the time. So I could actually do different tiles for it. And I started putting things together and started making characters, and you had a sprite editor and everything that I could make animation and basic scripting logic.
So you're learning it all yourself. You're just self-teaching yourself all this stuff.
And I wasn't getting any dates, so I figured, what the heck, right? It was basically school, work. And I basically, at that point, was graduating high school, and I had to go to college. This is the start of the generation of, you want to flip burgers for the rest of your life? Everybody has to go to college and get a degree in archaeology or something, right? And not get hired. And so I was applying for computer science at Cal Poly Pomona at the time, and I didn't have a car. I was a weird kid. I didn't like.
In California too. That's tough.
My brother was going to the same school, so I just hitch a ride to him in the morning and then go back, because he and I have always been super close.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, just the dream of having a car didn't appeal to me. I couldn't afford it at the time, so I'm like, why even bother? And so then, I was telecommuting and basically staying up all night working on Jazz and popping caffeine pills during the day to stay awake during my classes, and going to play like Mortal Kombat at the arcade and eating frozen yogurt, sustaining myself on frozen yogurt with very little money. And then, I hated the idea of going to college at the time. I really did not like it. It wasn't even the real kind of American college experience of the first year. Everyone just drinks and gets high and has sex. No, this was like just telecommute there, come home, work in your game. And I wanted to just
School was a job, effectively. You had 2 jobs.
It really was. And so, it's really easy to be like, oh, you should work 2 jobs, et cetera. Like, well, no, I wanted to move out of my mother's house because she wasn't running the air conditioning. And then eventually I had a girlfriend at the time, so I wanted a place to hang out with her in private. And so, I completed Jazz, and Jazz hit the market, and this was about the 6-month point in college. And I got my first check from Tim Sweeney from Jazz being this kind of mega success. And I looked at that, and I was just like, college. Like, you guys, I'm not going back. And so, luckily I didn't have any student loans.
It's after that, then you move out to Epic, right?
So I hadn't moved to work with Epic yet. I basically, during Jazz Jackrabbit, everybody was doing this kind of telecommute thing where we'd submit builds online back and forth. And then there was
which has now come around. There are a lot of teams doing
full
that
circle,
now.
virtual office. And then what we wound up doing one summer, this was the summer of The Lion King, mind you, because I remember listening to that soundtrack on my portable CD player,
Elton John
baby.
action.
Yeah.
Can you feel the love tonight?
Oh yeah, and we were in one apartment where One Must Fall was getting completed by Rob Elam. I was completing Jazz with IGN, and James Smalls was doing the very, very first early prototype of what would later become Unreal.
Yeah.
It was a game, you're a mech in a cave, which if you really think about it, is a really bad idea. Because mechs by nature are slow and moving. You're going to put them in a dark, enclosed underground. But he had this voxel engine that could do like the ceiling. It started as like a magic carpet type game. And then that was the summer again. We shipped Jazz, and I got my first check for $5,000, which I didn't know later I had to pay my own taxes on. I found that out the hard way. Then I went to the mall and I tried to buy a bunch of stuff. And I was only able to spend like $600 of it, just buying random just to do it. And Stephen King books and Bugs Bunny shirts and that was weird.
The mall cannot contain your wealth.
And then I got my 91 Saturn, which was my first car, which was not a bad car.
So, but at some point, soon after you do move out, you leave home, you go out
first apartment. And then eventually what happens is Epic says, we don't want to be in Maryland because Maryland kind of sucks. No offense to Maryland. Let's go someplace warmer in the south that's a little bit cheaper. And they wind up in Raleigh before Raleigh was cool because Steve Polge, one of the main folks over at Epic, AI programmer, came from a networking background where he made the first AI Reaper bot for Quake back in the day.
And Epic hired him.
He said, why not try Raleigh? And I show up in Raleigh to visit. I'm like, well, there's a Burger King and a mall, so I'm happy. And then Epic just kind of picked a Cary, which was kind of close enough to Raleigh itself, because downtown Raleigh was terrible.
You're in the triangle there.
Yeah, exactly. And then we just started working on all our stuff at that point.
So what is your mom? How are your parents reacting to when you move across the country to make video games?
Well, so my dad, God bless him, he actually just died one day when I was 15. He had smoked most of his life. He only started running the last few years of his life and kind of trying to take care of himself. And one day he's on the golf course and just kaput. And it was one of those things that was kind of heartbreaking at the time, being 15 years old.
Oh, I can't imagine.
And my mom, this was when we were in New England at the time, back outside of Boston, and my mom had a half sister in Southern California, and then she suggested we move to Southern California, and then eventually Epic moved me, of course, to North Carolina.
Right.
But my mom was in a process of this is as everything was first gestating, of kind of falling back in love with someone new she met in California and doing her own thing to the point where I could do my own thing.
Yeah.
And so she was so busy, love is a many splendid thing with her new husband. And I'm like, all right, well, you guys are just on dates and stuff. I'm just going to make my games. And so she just kind of let me do my thing, And so it was one of those things that, I had that moment years ago, like with my dad passing, where you're just, really accepting, he's gone, and having that realization that, he'd probably be pretty proud.
I was going to say, he never got to see your big success.
No, man, but it's also, it's one of those things that, he was a great man who raised, 5 wonderful boys. And they didn't know when to stop. I think they kept gunning for a girl, and it just every time up another boy, another boy, another boy, and then it's just the first of the family, as always the case, is the one where they ride his ass the hardest. You got to go to West Point and get your degree and play football and everything. By the time they get to me, they're like, he's lighting fires in the woods. I don't care anymore. And so it was that freedom that allowed me to pursue the whole game thing, which thankfully I wanted to make games. And also make money doing it, by the way. That's one of the big things about this business. Everyone, they assume it's a dirty thing if you want to eat and pay your bills and stuff. And it's like, no, we're making commercial art in an industry. You make something that's personal, that's great, but also you need to keep the lights on. It is its own version of it, man.
So I guess I was going to wait till the Gears of War part, but so is the Adam Phoenix story arc, is that related to your dad?
Yeah, so Lee Perry, Rod Ferguson, and I all lost our fathers at an early age. So the whole Adam Phoenix arc, is based on, I used to have, and I realize we're talking about the plot of daddy issues in a bro chainsaw shooter with lizard men here. I understand that, but that was my angle of trying to make the game personal in regards to.
But that's what's cool about Gears of War to me is it is this sort of seemingly superficial thing on the surface, but it turns out there is substance and meaning to it, and that's why people still care about it.
They like to easily dismiss that kind of stuff. It's just a stupid bro shooter. It's brown and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, apart from the game mechanics, we kind of created kind of a fun, cool, interesting world, with characters you ultimately could quote and care about. Yeah. There's so many games of that generation that you can't quote it. You don't remember any of the lines, but you remember the stuff Dom and sup and Coltrane's woos and Bears complaining and all that. And but anyway, to backpedal before we get to Gears. So then basically Epic, even before we moved to Raleigh, now I'm getting my timeline mixed up. Epic basically had me when I was living in my apartment in Southern California, telecommute to Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, where Digital Extremes was.
Ah, yes, another associate of theirs.
Co-developers of Unreal, and now Warframe, and having much success with that. So
Warframe would become Gears.
Hang on.
Right?
No, Warframe was its own thing. That's another whole timeline. We're getting our timeline.
My bad.
So basically, we made.
I'll let you tell the story.
Telecommuted for over a year.
Yep.
Physically commuted. And this is when I started flying all the damn time. Shipped the first Unreal. It did okay. I think we got over by a publisher at that time. Then Epic goes, let's move to North Carolina, and we were going to make an add-on pack at that point. It was going to be called the Bot Pack. It was going to be a multiplayer add-on with just AI that you could just play in Unreal. And I was pissed off at the time because I wanted to make a game at that point called Overfiend, which was basically Doom in kind of an anime city where you're fighting demons. It was kind of a big weeble-woo back then. And so then basically, we're in North Carolina, and Mark Rain sits us all down one time. He's like, look, this whole expansion could be its own game. We should call it Unreal Tournament or something like that, and that wound up sticking. And then this is the era where Quake was becoming big, and Carmack launched Quake World, which was his great whole online component, exactly, which was wonderful. And and I wanted to be it at the time. I wanted to be John Romero. Romero was my hero. And then Unreal Tournament came out, and that was where about '98 we really started getting that kind of good traction in North Carolina in the studio.
And that's where I want to back you up a second to Unreal, because Unreal's a game at that point in time, you just alluded to it. It was the king. They were it. They were the unprecedented.
I used to listen, being able to cast Ice-T later, and this is going to be really goofy again, so bear with me. It's one of those things. He had this one line from New Jack City where he said, I had nothing and I wanted it, you had everything and you flaunted it. And he used to sing that lyric thinking about the photos of Carmack's Ferrari and Romero's Ferrari, and Romero posting photos of his mostly marble mansion from the success of Wolf and Doom and whatnot. Yeah. And I was like, I want to be that. I'll show you, John Romero. And then that was part of my motivation to make a great game, but also to pay bills and have nice cars and stuff.
I was gonna say, so Carmack is why you have a Lamborghini now?
Well, I had two and I got rid of one because I think driving is stupid, but that's another conversation for another conversation. I can't wait for the self-driving car, just bring it. The whole car thing in America, car culture, it's you're defined by your vehicle and all that, and it's just I'm kind of over it now at this point. I respect cars.
You've been to the mountaintop. Let's be fair.
To be fair, but to put the top down and to go for a Sunday drive for 15 minutes is a fun thing. The whole drive 30 minutes to 90 minutes to get to work. I was talking to a friend of mine who works at Naughty Dog. He works in Santa Monica where Naughty Dog is. He lives in the Valley, which is, for those of you who don't know Southern California, that's a minimum of 90 minutes either way, 3 hours out of your day. I'm just and it's just Southern California. It's expensive. So anyway, Unreal 1. So this was back when id was making Quake Test. And
the Q test. I remember when that dropped to the internet. It was
and
amazing.
it just I remember the sounds of the spring peepers and the water areas and the dark dank dungeons, and the actual full 3D was crazy because it wasn't that fake kind of like Wolfenstein back in the day, sprite based stuff. And it was lightning fast, and that rocket launcher to rule all with the quad damage and everything. And I remember looking at that. This was the start of my realization of that when you're making a product, you need to counter program. We were just talking about this in our panel. And Quake was largely dark, Cthulhu-inspired, dank dungeons with demons. And so we're working on, as we worked through the first Unreal, we decided to go with beautiful colored lighting and sky castles and local kind of indigenous culture, these four-armed bipeds and the reptilian enemies that have blades that are kind of Predator-like, right? And all these kind of crashed spaceship, husks of spaceships. Force Awakens was on the airplane on the way out here, and the whole scene where you have the Star Destroyer that's like she's exploring it. And I'm like, oh, I forgot we did that in the first Unreal. And I still, one of the parting words I said, to skip ahead for 2 seconds, when I left Epic, is I always wanted to see kind of an Unreal 1 reboot out of somebody that's kind of like spiritually the same game, and you kind of go back to the planet, because a lot of the ideas, a giant, the mystical powers of the natives on the planet that could elevate things and lift them up and have a sky city in the sky. There's very fantastic kind of Rodney Matthews kind of classic sci-fi or fantasy fiction and mixed with sci-fi in there. And as an IP, it was always kind of fun and cool. And we got our first ever big magazine cover in Next Generation magazine, and that's still I still have that laying around somewhere.
Well, I still remember the wonder of that first. Of setting foot on the planet.
So that was the contrast. I did the very first level, which was the Vortex Rikers ones, which was basically, you're escaping the ship that's just crashed, and I'm teasing in the Scar alien, when this is what I already knew at that point, even in my early to mid 20s, that when you're...
Oh, the J is silent, huh? At the end.
Yeah, Scar. You never knew that? Yeah.
I never knew that.
That was just me trying to.
There was no internet back then.
That was me trying to be fancy with the IP, because I wanted there to be that one was like, actually the J is silent. That's. So anyway, that whole first level, if you go back and look it up on YouTube, you hear the monster. You hear the monster, growling. You see the glimpses and gunshots of it tearing, the crew apart behind a door, and then it runs off, and you see its tail.
Yeah. To
the point where we went from that claustrophobic, really explosions going off, escaping the ship, to this really wide open, beautiful kind of like we inadvertently made this kind of like metaphor for rebirthing of a character, coming from this horrible environment to this beautiful, lush planet that later winds up to be harsh, but still nonetheless, the 3D sky with the the lit clouds, and
it brought my Pentium 133 to its
knees. Pentium 133, the procedural waterfall, and you can just jump all the way down in the water, and there's actual polygonal fish in the water, that whole level was done by a designer named Pancho Eccles. He still dabbles in the business, but at some point he just said and decided to move to the northern wild of Canada and build he and his wife and kids a log cabin. So hey,
nice.
Like he's training for a Rocky movie or something. And but he was using Lightwave at that point, which was one of the early 3D programs, kind of like Max or Maya. And he experimented with taking, still relatively low poly environments, but just stretching them out and making them just really spacious. And he wound up being responsible for what we call these hub sections, which were the wide open areas, the trench where the spaceship crashed, or the enormous outdoor areas that you could literally be under almost a Star Destroyer, and kind of exploring it before you go inside, and kind of explore all these different alien ships and species, because the idea was the planet was the Bermuda Triangle of the galaxy, where ships just get sucked into its gravitational pull, and everything is living on this planet trying to carve out an existence.
Well, as the studio so Epic is, everybody starts to get pulled into Unreal. You've done Jazz. When everybody starts seeing what Tim is doing with this engine, which would of course go on to make you a whole lot of money and
prop up the AAA industry.
Yeah, I mean, was everybody on the team just blown away by what Tim was doing with this?
No,
engine?
we were exhausted, because we were the game took 3 to 4 years or so from inception to completion.
Yeah,
I literally had $500 left in my bank account. Tim and Mark, did not draw salary for like a year of it, right?
Wow.
And I was doing a long distance relationship with my ex at the time, which in hindsight I found out was rather tumultuous once I found a whole bunch of notes in that box, by the way, but that's neither here nor there.
Long distance is not it's tough.
Yeah, and
Been there.
Young people just like to fight sometimes in a bad relationship. And so for me, it was a really, really tough, dark period where they had a temporary townhouse where I was living there with Tim Sweeney and Cedric Fiorentino, who would later go on to make Facing Worlds. As well, worked on Star Wars Battle Pod recently. So yeah, and
cool,
James Schmaltz was, he's from Canada, but his I think his then wife was living in London, and so which was still
London, Ontario.
Yeah, which is super cute up there. I was like, why didn't you put the studio in London? But he put it in Waterloo because of University of Waterloo, because there's so many good engineering students that come out of there, and of course the building that we developed the game in would later be the headquarters anchor for Research in Motion for BlackBerry, which is now who knows what's happening there. Yeah, I think the world moved on.
Circle of life, bring it back to Elton John.
But we got that. Like, I had to go through a winter in Kitchener, Waterloo, man, and it was, I'm from Boston, and I was used to living in Southern California. There's one time where I had this rental car I'd always get at Person Airport, drive all the way over there, and somebody broke into my car, and it snowed, and I'm driving back to the apartment with the wind, and there's snow and like. I mean, I'm not digging salt mine here, but I mean, I'm making a video game. I'm not curing cancer, but it's still like it's just like I just want to eat my curry and go home and ship this game. And then we of course didn't get a lot of money off the first Unreal because the publisher kind of us and whatnot.
Was that at Infogrames?
It was GT Interactive back in the day.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't know the actual full history because Tim and Mark always, me being the creative, they just kind of like will deal with all this crap. All I know is we didn't see a ton of money off that, which we then rapidly went into Unreal Tournament, and then that's what started. Really making good money.
Always surprised me as a gamer that Unreal 2 didn't come around until years later when you guys had Legend Entertainment do it. The guys that had done the Wheel of Time game.
Just ran into Scott Dalton actually. He's at Valve now. So it's 2 degrees of separation now. Facebook's like, yeah, it's 3.6. I'm like, no, it's 2. Especially in this business. So yeah, the Unreal 2 was an interesting time period because I was kind of acting as executive producer, and there's a lot of talent at Legend right there.
Yeah.
But they wanted to make their own game, which I respect the hell out of. They made Wheel of Time based on the Robert Jordan best-selling series, which is a really cool. It had this kind of spy versus spy trap mode you can do and everything, and absolutely gorgeous game. And then it's like, well, now you're going to make Unreal 2 for these guys, and you could tell the creatives at Legend were like, dude, we just made Wheel of Time, like we're hardcore. We make these beautiful story-based games. Now you just want to make a sci-fi shooter about Predator-looking characters, and so I wasn't really managing the IP at that point. It wound up being this weird Highlander 2 kind of offshoot, and it wasn't inherently a bad game, but you could tell it was very disjointed development, where each LD, each designer was making their own
it turned out fine, but it just didn't land the way Unreal landed.
It just wasn't really an Unreal game. They had a whole hub you went back to. In hindsight, your crew's captain, the female character's design was quite ridiculous, especially if you look at it now in 2016, her boobs hanging out and everything. And and there's interesting characters in the ship, and everybody always says they're going to do a hub, and they never do a hub, but they did. And it was a solid game, but with the expectations of the first Unreal, the fact that it wasn't the original team, the press kind of trashed it. And this, I think this was about 2002, 3, somewhere around the 2002-ish time frame, if I recall. I remember talking about it at DICE in Las Vegas one time.
What's your fondest memory of the original Unreal before you moved on to UT?
It was, well, for me,
as you said, it sounds like it was sort of a nightmare in your life.
This was when I was at the age where you either go to the movies or you go to the mall, and there really wasn't anything else to do. I didn't even drink until I was 25. Made up for it since then. And then I'd come home to where I was living in Ontario, California. The irony's not lost to me going between Ontario and Canada. And so there's the outlet mall there. I can't remember what it's called, something Mills or like one of those.
I've driven
Mills
by
ones.
it a million times.
Yeah, on the way to Palm Springs to have a nice vacation and just get the hell through it. And I'd drive down to that outlet mall and just hang out at I think Virgin Records or whatever, which is where I first got my copies of Preacher and learned to love Preacher. Don't it up, Seth Rogen. And there's a giant standee for the first Unreal that was in the front of Electronics Boutique or whatever it was
with
at the time.
Scar on it, right?
Yeah. And that was the moment I was like, you see the FOV shift on me, and you're like, oh my God, this is a real thing. Because, now I'm all on Team Digital in regards to games, and, we just announced Lawbreakers is going to be on Steam, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
However, back then, to have a product on store shelves felt weird and magical.
Absolutely.
And that was one of those things where and then when it finally hit, you could hold the box, and there was a real product of, 3+ years of everybody slogging their asses up to this college town that had nothing to do besides work in a game. That's when it felt pretty real and magical.
Did you feel like Unreal Tournament is when you kind of found your true calling? Because that seems to, if you look at your career history since then, it seems like Unreal Tournament sort of set the tone for what has been the rest of your career to date.
For Unreal Tournament, this idea of and of course Gears had its whole single player component, but the idea of a shooter. And to be honest, I've said this before, we do shooters because it's the easiest way to interact with the world. It's a trace, bang, bang, something, shoot the pot, it breaks, shoot the bad guy, falls over, right? And he's like, if he falls over with good ragdoll, even better. But this, it's kind of, shooter, even going back to Jazz, Jazz was inherently a shooter game. And so it's one of those situations where, people playing together, either on a LAN party or on the online space, that's really a lot of the bread and butter of what why I enjoy this genre. And the funny thing was the first Unreal's multiplayer was completely broken. Tim didn't test the netcode. I remember we all went online to play it, and it was completely broken. And so that's one of the other limiting factors for the first game, which is why we chose to make the second game with Brandon Reinhardt, who's now crushing it at Valve on Dota. So again, 2 degrees of separation. And then I remember this was at the time, again, living in Southern California. This is when GameSpy was over in Orange County, and they'd throw what they call Bastards Beatdown. One of the main guys, Mark Surface, who was one of the guys responsible for the GameSpy browser, would throw these LAN parties, and I'd drive out there in my '91 Saturn and play the game all night. and just drive home bleary-eyed in the morning.
Yeah.
And that's when I really learned a lot about like, you know, Quake and how, you know, I think Quake 2 was out at the time, and learning how to really like hone a multiplayer game that I then applied to the look and feel of what Unreal Tournament would become.
So Unreal Tournament ended up, I remember well, I mean, there was this rivalry, at least amongst the community of gamers, between Quake 3 Arena and Unreal Tournament. They ended up, I remembered them coming out very close together, and when I went and looked it up, 2 days apart.
Was it?
They were 2 days apart. They shipped virtually at the exact same time.
Yeah, this was my professional, like, you know, Rocky versus Creed.
Yeah, did you guys feel was there a rivalry to you internally?
Yeah, I remember we were at GDC that year, and a bunch of id guys came over. This was the new guard. This was when, you know, Paul Steed was there, et cetera. Rest in peace, Paul. As well as Brian Hook and a lot of those folks.
Graham.
Yeah, and Graham, which I actually hung out with last night. Great guy. And so they all come over and they saw, you know, what we were pulling off with, which was technically not as good a technology, because Carmack had all the curved surfaces and like the level with the giant tongue. It's weird.
Yeah,
now.
I remember that.
And then, you know, we had this kind of, you know, lower polygon but higher resolution textures. And our own look and feel, and our own more unique weapons that weren't just as simple.
The flag cannon, the biogun,
the translocator, all that stuff,
yeah.
right? And our settings were kind of fun and cool. We had like a pirate ship. We had like a castle in the sky. We
a lot
had
of maps too.
Worlds, a lot. Then, you know, we came out and did pretty well. And I can't remember what the final sales numbers were, but I mean, we came out, you know, slinging in regards to, you know, we got Computer Gaming World's Game of the Year at that point. And, you know, Quake 3 Arena still is a classic, wonderful experience. Their movement is still, in my opinion, better than UT's. But, you know, we just felt like we showed up for the fight, and we did okay.
Yeah.
You know, even if, you know, I don't remember the sales panned out, but, you know, we felt like we'd finally arrived.
So then you move, then Gears comes along out of the Warfare tech demo,
well,
right?
First there was Unreal Tournament 2003, which was kind of the follow-up.
With Digital Extremes.
Yeah, and we also we ported Unreal Tournament to PlayStation
to Xbox.
PlayStation 2. There's a Dreamcast version as well. There's a lot of Unreal there. My eldest brother who doesn't even play games, like, what's next? Unreal the damn musical? Like, how much Unreal? And that's why I'm sitting there, can we make a new IP? Can we make a new IP?
Yeah.
And so we're doing Unreal Tournament. Unreal Tournament 2004 comes out, and it kind of has a resurgence of the IP. We do the vehicle mode.
Yep.
Fun fact about that vehicle mode, if you remember the Scorpion vehicle, the little buggy that had the blades come out of it from the Onslaught mode, later wound up being a stunt mode that was a mod that was done by, I can't remember, I think it's Nathan Overman or Ben Beckwith, one of Dave Hagewood's talented folks. That code morphed eventually into what became Rocket League.
Interesting.
So when I ran into, you know, Jess Hagewood, who runs the studio with Dave last night, and, you know, she's one of the folks that I hug, you know, in the hotel lobby. And she had some of her folks from Psyonix with her, and I joke with her about their overnight success, because they'd been at it for 15 years. You know, they almost shut the studio down at one point. And now, you know, she's like, come when you come to San Diego, let's hang out, blah, 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 because we've always bonded over dogs. So that code wound up being that, but then UT04 did pretty darn well.
Yeah,
but it was still at the point where, like, can we just make something new? Because at the time, I'd been watching Band of Brothers. And I've been really paying attention. Like, when you're young, at least for me as a kid, and you learn about World War II, you're like, whatever, I'm gonna go watch G.I. Joe, right? Like, you don't really know what was at stake.
You don't have the gravity.
You really don't, right? And, you know, Private Ryan hadn't come out, which I think should be shown to kids like 6th grade and whatnot, even though it's horribly violent. And so it's one of those things where I became this fascination with this kind of like World War II desaturated kind of like war is hell gravitas, right?
Yeah.
And then, you know, we started building up the first version of it, which was going to be like enemy territory with vehicles, Quake Wars type of thing. That was just codename Warfare.
Yeah.
And then Resident Evil 4 came out, and then we got the spherical harmonic rendering of Unreal Engine 3 first pass up, and we looked at this like 3D rendered soldier that looked really cool. And we looked at Resident Evil 4, and we looked at what we were building, and we're like, okay, we need a regular campaign component with this, as of course eventually multiplayer.
Right.
But we need to go back to making a campaign, telling a story, and building a universe. And that's where, like, you know, kind of the whole Gears thing came about, but it was codename Warfare for like years for a while.
So that's when it becomes Gears of War in your head at that point?
Part of it initially, from like the gestation of what Warfare was going to be, was a GDC tech demo you can still find on YouTube.
Oh yeah, I've seen it.
Whereas the dude in the cog armor fighting the kind of what was called Geist at the time, Nintendo's that Ghost game made us have to dumpster that name for Locust instead. You know, they're like fighting underground, and there's like a random like deployment of drop ships, and the one dude rips off the other dude's arm and beats him to death with it, and which later wound up being in like Gears 3 or whatnot. And you know, somebody from our publisher at the time, it was actually Microsoft, I think it was Jim Vievert, came to saw our GDC demo and he's like, that's the kind of stuff we need for what we're doing next. Like we need a cinematic kind of cool shooter war world. Of course Halo was, in the process of blowing up and becoming big for them.
Right.
And I wanted I looked at Halo, and as much as I respected and appreciated Halo always felt like bright and cheery, and like you're fighting little guys, you're like, man, they're everywhere, and you're shooting purple guns and things like that, and everything's very, very lush and green, and with the fantastic music. But I'm like, I wanted to be like the rated R, like the darker version of that.
It's kind of funny that you're saying this because you're describing the exact opposite of with Unreal, where you were counter programming the gritty thing with the bright thing, and now you wanted to counter program the bright thing with the gritty thing.
So from 2006 to 2016, you saw the shift from the Zack Snyder desaturated browns of Gears and Killzone all the way to like we're at Overwatch and Battleborn, which look like completely every color. They look like a Pixar film.
Yeah.
And then what I'm gonna try and do with the game we're bringing out, Lawbreakers, is find the halfway point to bring it back to something that's a little bit of colors, but not full on every color, and actually has some swearing and violence, and is actually a little edgier, kind of a grown-up version of that. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Now, we'll get to Lawbreakers, but legend has it that you guys, in particular, Gears of War and Epic Games, are effectively responsible for the Xbox 360 having 512 megs of RAM in it.
Yeah, it was Tim Sweeney and Mark Rain went and to kiss the ring with Microsoft.
Because it had 256 in it at one point.
Yeah, I think it was Shane Kim. I can't remember who was in charge at the time, but Tim's like, this isn't going to work. Like, if you're going to make a new system that's going to clearly look better than the first Xbox, you need to double down on the RAM. And your cost of goods will go up, et cetera, et cetera. But again, you make it a loss leader. You'll make it up with game fee sales and everything in the back end. And that wound up costing Microsoft a lot of upfront money, but it wound up making sure that the Xbox 360 was a very great system and had a lot of great games. And Halo was nowhere to be found at the time. That was the other thing.
Right, not with the 360. Yeah, it didn't come till much later.
Exactly. So if you look at that generation of gamers with the first Gears, it was a great campaign. You could co-op it, and it had a solid multiplayer that was almost cut out of the game too, by the way. But that's neither here nor there.
Yes, it is. That's exactly why we're here.
Well, it's my old boss I was chatting with last night, Mike Capps. He and I, he's hilarious.
How does Gears 1 multiplayer almost get cut?
Well, I mean, it was just like we always say about, with the current game we're building the freeway while the car is going at 9,000 miles an hour on fire. And we're under intense pressure from Microsoft to get this game out for holiday.
Yeah.
Doing the E3 demos and all that, and they didn't really think the cover-based gameplay would be any fun. And Lee Perry was spearheading a lot of the level design at the time, and we made maps that felt a lot like Counter-Strike. Where Counter-Strike in hindsight actually is very good at having a front, but some of the Counter-Strike maps, the one with the house in particular, somewhat more like Call of Duty. It was a bit porous. And we found that, the Gears is kind of slow clunkiness and slow turning speed and radius of the analog sticks, that people getting behind you was, kind of frustrating. And if they earned that getting behind you from, covering fire and taking cover, then they should be able to kill you and chainsaw you or shotgun you. And then eventually they made, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Lee Perry or Jim Brown made the map Gridlock, which was kind of the archetypical Gears map, where like you start off with kind of the half donut, and everyone go, and they can kind of see and shoot each other a little bit at range, but they can't really do much, and that's when the game of hide and go kill starts happening. And then I originally wanted a Counter-Strike type of system where you bought essentially weapons between rounds, but Rod Ferguson, a badass producer, realized, because I was a little green with production at that time still even, with the UI work and balancing and all that, and Rod made the executive decision, dude, let's throw some power weapons in the map, and that'll be the attractors for why people run throughout the map, and the boom shots and the grenades and all that. So your default weapons are pretty cool, but let's make the even easier killing devices like the carrots that kind of drive the gameplay and the flow of the maps, right?
So take me back to you do Gears 2 and then Gears 3. You've kind of touched on Twitter about how the story arc. We talked a little bit about the Adam Phoenix stuff with that. We never actually really came back to that. So how did the arc of the Gears plot sort of mirror what was going on in your life?
Well, Gears 1, I had a starter marriage. I always joke about it, and
me too. You get your first one out of the way, right? Yeah,
we learn balance by falling. And not to speak ill, because we were young and whatnot, but it is what it is. But I was going through like a divorce, which is a very painful process. And this was the period where, like, during the divorce, I was listening to Mad World, which I'd never told anybody about, by the way. That was like my own little quiet, like, cry myself to sleep, because my life was at that time song. And wait for it, Evanescence is My Immortal. Which is really cheesy, but it's still
sign of the times. It's all right. It's like 2005.
It's a really good song.
It's
really
fine.
Good song. And so then that the dust was settling for that. I was actually GDC because in North Carolina, if you're going through divorce, you have to wait a year before. It's weird Southern laws, man. Like, are you sure? Are you sure? And I was at GDC when I got the message from my lawyer that like everything had been settled. That's why GDC is such a homecoming for me. And so I was going through that like really tough period. Like I was back to only like to being in a $500 a month apartment, a block away from Epic. I had lost most of my Unreal and Unreal Tournament money. Back at square one. I had just like this old car and everything, and was basically burning everything down and starting over.
Yeah.
And then that's why Marcus was called the Phoenix, because that was my personal kind of come rising from the ashes. And then the whole daddy thing also was in there too. And this was like such an intense period of my life. Like you think about, if you remember 10 years ago, 2006 or so time frame. Ish, when I had to demo Gears on stage at the Grauman's or whatever they call it, Chinese theater in Hollywood there. Hey Bill Gates, we're being filmed for MTV, let's do this live demo. In hindsight, I'm sitting here going like, you cocky little you had no idea, Cliff, what you like the significance of this point in your life for turning your career around, to turning around your personal life, to turning around your finances, to making a pop culture phenomenon that was $1 billion IP that people tattoo their body with and stuff. That's the thing about, quick side note, was I'm serving in the advisory board of this, charity they called Stack Up that brings games to troops who are deployed, as well as give them games to kind of help a little bit, once they're home with, PTSD and things like that. And the amount of soldiers that have come up to me and told me that, they have whatever rig, and, whatever, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever they were, to play the game with their friends and co-op and split screen and all that, to kind of get them through the time, and then show me, like the COG tags that they have of their fallen friends they actually died over there and everything. I'm just like, I think the least I can do is, serve in this, charity and kind of, help out, because I always say support the troops, because, you and I aren't getting shot at. Anyway, so then, the whole arc of Gears wound up ultimately being, the end of Gears. So my at this point, my favorite place to go during crunch time during the Gears franchise was the coast of North Carolina. It's really beautiful out there. The winter, it's it's a little quiet and everything, but it's just it's an hour and 45, 2 hours away is the closest one, and that wound up being like my super happy place, like to just go there and just drink a beer and just read a book, or and call up the service that would basically like hey bro, with the auger, stick in the umbrella, 2 chairs. At the end of the day, they grab it and run off. And so then having bounced back fiscally after the first Gears one. And Microsoft cut, Epic a good check, and I went from like, very, very little in my bank account to finally being really comfortable again. Yeah. And then decided to, move into this was actually in the, I was dating my ex, the new ex at the time. I dated a lot. And she was in the Gears of War MTV special. And then I was in the middle of the Mad World meeting one day, and she texted me, and she's like, entertain me, I'm bored. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm at this turning point making this game that's going to completely, hopefully, turn around my life right now, and you want me to entertain you? What is wrong with you? I mean, to be fair, I was like 30 and she was 19, and so she was very young 19. And actually broke up with her on the MTV special.
Well then.
Before I went to E3, because that was an actual breakup. Because I'm like, I don't need this right now. Like, you don't, your family's well off, I'm starting over here. Like, I don't need this, I can't babysit, and give you attention for this right now. We later dated for a little while longer, et cetera, and it was what it was, but it was one of those situations that, starting over in the Gears 2 time frame, that was when we were full on like Cliffy mode, and like the Gears 2 multiplayer, man, Dave Nash and I, the old
chainsaw duels.
Yeah, but it was broken at first, if you remember. That was just when Call of Duty was really getting the console traction to become the phenomenon that it is today. And this was the point where Gears won our fans, and then it was classic innovators syndrome with Gears 2, where if you change too much, you've ruined the game. If you don't change anything, they just say it's Gears 1.5. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And still people like, Gears 1 was the best. I personally think Gears 3 was, but that's neither here nor there. I agree. Well, that's when we really honed things, and we had dedicated servers and everything. And we really had multiple game types of different characters, women in the battle up. It was cool. And then going back to Gears 2, those coming home and like when that game came out, the big marketing campaign, and then watching the little cogs spin for matchmaking, and spin, and spin, and just being like, like this was also the era where everyone was really wisening up to renting games and trading in games, and because hey, if I was back at that phase where I was broke and only had $39.99 to buy
$60 is a lot of money.
Yeah, dude, it is. It's a good dinner, and so I would have done it too. I'm not going to do that rant, but about the whole used games thing. But there's a hole in the bucket and that's money that's not going back to pay for increasingly ridiculous development budgets and feature sets. That's a whole other conversation. And so that's when Gears like kind of hit this glass ceiling. It was first game $6 million, second game's going on, it hits this glass ceiling, boom, $6 million. And that's where like Gears somehow hit this like 6 or so million copies sold ceiling. Which, when I was at Epic, I was thinking about, before I left, if we're going to do another Gears, how do we even get past that?
Right. Jokingly
thinking about what would a first-person Gears look like, things like that, right? Huh. That's, it's ancient history, and I think Rod and Microsoft, or Rod and Coalition are going to do a great job with it. I'm dying to play it. Send me a copy. And then Gears 3, of course, was kind of the culmination of everything with like
Horde 2.0.
Yeah, well, that's when like I first started seeing Lauren, and like it was one of those things that Anya was originally incepted as this kind of character, as your dispatch, your Sherpa, your guide as the Phoenix to get out of there, and then to have her evolve into kind of like I saw a lot of Lauren in Anya in Gears 3, and I told my cinematics director and the writer, Gears 3 has to end once all the shit hits the fan. Sadly, Marcus sees his father just crumble in front of him and sacrifice himself because he experimented on himself with the emulsion like the Curies did, right? And then to have him go turn into dust, and then Marcus, he's so tired, and you never see him without his armor up to that point. Even at the beginning, he's kind of shrouded. And for me, the whole him walking down to the beach and taking the armor off was like my whole metaphor for going to the coast of Carolina, and that first feeling when your feet get in the warm sand and you just kind of walk down and just that relaxation of the coast, and the whole removing the armor and like landing, and the idea of it's always kind of alluded to like Marcus and Anya kind of like each other a lot. There's a good relationship there. Who knows if it could blossom into romance or whatnot? But the idea of she says we have a tomorrow. And that's, which if you saw JD Phoenix, it's Marcus' son, who I don't even remember if they wound up using Anya. I hope they did. But the whole, all she does is put her hand on his, and then she puts her head on his shoulder, and that was like me and Lauren at the beach escaping from crunch time. So it's kind of like the full circle. And this is why, when I see developers, and I always gush because I think she's awesome, is Nina Freeman doing Sibel. And the fact that here's a Rockstar game designer who made a game, a simple narrative-based game, but about the time she had her heart broken in an MMO, and she acted in herself and everything about meeting this guy online and losing their virginity together, and then he's just like, see ya. And I'm just like, oh my God, like that's why the kind of games I like these days are the simple little personal ones, and that and VR stuff. Those are the ones that I play.
We're after you're going through the divorce, this whole Gears arc that's mirroring your own life. Are you seeing a therapist through all this, or is the making of the games the therapy?
Oh no, I was done with therapy at that point, and it's for some reason people are weird about talking about therapy in this country. Like, dude,
I went after my divorce.
Dude, having a person that you can talk to that is going to give you like their own somewhat objective but not judgy opinion that you're paying for this is like the greatest thing ever. And so I was seeing a therapist at the time, which is eventually made me realize that I shouldn't be married. That was what led to that.
Yeah.
So that was at the point where, I basically, was like, why am I even married? Why did I do this? At 29 years old, a week before my 30th birthday, that's when I moved out and got that tiny little apartment, and then eventually started dating my ex from the MTV special, etc. So that was kind of that whole thing. But it's one of those things. Marriage is a beautiful thing, regardless of who's doing it. For two people to stand in front of their peers and community and to promise to dedicate themselves for the rest of their lives, it's not easy. But man, it's like people out there just really make sure the person you're going to marry before you really ever consider it, because people change. If you're going to grow in a relationship, this just got really heavy. Grow together. There's this. When I first started dating Lauren, I used this whole phrase with her because like the other day, she's still getting ready because she's got the crazy hair right now. And I'm sitting, in the hotel restaurant, having a rather large espresso since we all hang out late night at these events. And I have a grapefruit night. I haven't had grapefruit in a long time. I don't think she's ever even seen me eat a grapefruit. It's like a nice light breakfast. I got a busy day ahead of me. Maybe I'll have some yogurt. She comes down. She's like, "What is that? You never eat grapefruit. I've known you for like 7 years now. I've never seen you eat a single grapefruit." I'm like, "Let me have a grapefruit." And it goes back to that old commercial. It's like the really old 70s or 80s one about Jim never has a second cup of coffee, which is, I'm really dating myself right now. But that's the whole thing. I explained that commercial to Lauren. I'm like, you know what? If Jim wants a second cup of coffee, let Jim have a second cup of coffee. If suddenly I get home, one day and Lauren's like, hey, I decided to take one of those like, ballet type classes with, the Cirque du Soleil type, fabric and whatnot. I'll be like, you go do that.
Yeah.
As opposed to, this isn't the person I thought I knew.
Don't change.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, we dated for 2.5 years before she knew that I'm a beast at karaoke.
So then how do you, is this why this reinvention of Cliff as Gears comes to a close, is this why you walked away? Because you
I walked away because I got paid.
You retired.
Yeah.
So you you must have had options or some sort of vesting thing.
No, it's simple. This big Chinese company comes along, and they, I had a chunk of ownership in Epic. They buy out 40% of it without any, strings attached. And Epic at the time, and I say this very carefully because they've really kind of changed into their own entity. With Paragon looks cool, Fortnite looks cool, like their engines look great. We're using it ourselves, it's great. But at the time, there was this whole like, Gears was kind of a fluke. And I could pitch any idea to the company, and inevitably I'd have somebody in my office going, I don't buy it. And it was one of these situations where, like, I had a game idea where it was evil corporations, right? And one of the jaded programmers who shall not be named at the time comes into my office like, really, corporations? Really? And I'm like, dude, if you're gonna make a game like the one I was pitching, you have pretty much pirates, ninjas, zombies, aliens, robots. There's like 10 archetypes. You pick one. Batman beats up clowns for a living. I mean, you gotta pick one thing and go with it. And that was when I really just started creatively getting kind of frustrated. And I was helping out with Fortnite, trying to figure out, are we gonna do another Gears game? I don't know. And then the buyout came in, and I tried to renegotiate my contract, and they couldn't come to any sort of terms. And I was like, actually, the irony was, one day I just stopped going to work, which in hindsight was really unprofessional and not cool and disrespectful to Tim. But they tried to negotiate for a couple months, couldn't come to terms, so I just strong-armed it. I was like, I'm just not gonna come to work. And I go down to the beach with Lauren. This was late summer that year, and it was a gorgeous evening. Breeze was going and everything, and I get a phone call. I'm sitting down at the beach. I get a phone call from Tim. Hey, Cliff. That's my Tim voice. So, can we talk? You haven't been at work. And I'm like, Tim, I'm at the beach. I'm like 2 hours away. He's like, yeah, I'm here. He'd driven his Corvette all the way from Raleigh down to the beach to walk on the beach with me and try and say, like, dude, you got to come back to work or you got to go. Like, I can't deal with this indecision right now. And I sat there overnight and thought about it. The next day I sent in my resignation. Wow. And so that's the big thing about, what the beach means to me and the Carolina shore is the fact that I realized a lot of my big decisions in my adult life I've made down there. The decision to leave Epic, realizing I was going to marry Lauren, the decision to start Boss Key, a lot of the ideas about Lawbreakers, they all happen down there, right? And so
that's your spot. That's your happy place.
That was the moment, walking on the beach with her during crunch time one time, and I swore I would never get married again, And if we first started dating, I'm like, no, marriage is stupid. Owning a house, blah blah blah. And then, she broke me. And so, I remember holding her hand, looking back at her, walking on a beautiful beach. And I turn around and I go, I'm gonna have to marry you, aren't I? She's like, what? And then, of course, I asked her family and, did it the right way and everything. But I like to say, Ryan, that I like failed personal and professional endeavors because they teach you what you will and will not put up with.
Right.
After dating, being married once, dating a lot in between, and then, finding Lauren and her being this wonderful, unique, beautiful flower who's so freaking awesome, puts up with my I was like, look, hey, I like A, B, and C. I don't want to put up with X, Y, and Z. Can you do that? And she's like, yeah, I can do that. I'm like, good, we'll be good. And so it's communication, man. Communication's hard, It's the key to any relationship.
Do you have your lawyer or anybody that's calling you, telling trying to talk you out of walking away? It's like, hey, Cliff, this is a bad idea. You're 30-something. Why are you doing this?
Yeah, no, I was represented by Wayne, who's my lawyer. We actually had dinner last night. He's a good dude. And then Ophir Lupu, if you know, Ophir's kind of the mega agent who's, he actually technically represented me for almost like 10 years before he tried to renegotiate with Epic. And he represented, Ken Levine, a bunch of these kind of rock star developers. And it was one of those things, Ophir's, I wanted to try and stay at Epic. I wasn't really a fan of the way the environment had been going at the time. But also I had enough money in the bank that I could, it was a lot of money, man. And it was one of those situations like, in San Francisco, you could live comfortably, but in Raleigh, you live like a king.
Well,
you get
it's Lamborghini money at that point.
You can get a gorgeous house for $300,000 out there. That's my favorite thing when I try and hire somebody from Boss Key off the West Coast. The significant other gets on Zillow and they're on Realtor.com. They're like, wait, what? I can have an acre? Holy crap! And it's not like we're in the middle of absolutely like Fargo. Like, we're in a mini Austin that's on the up and up and has organic food and food trucks and all that stuff. But yeah, I was at the point where I was like, well, dude. And then a couple of years prior, this gentleman named Brendan Aribi came to the Epic offices with a duct tape phone that you could hold up to your face and look around environments with that was developed by John Carmack and Palmer Luckey. And this was again.
I used that thing at E3 a few years ago to play Doom 3.
Yep, and this was in the middle of this whole I had some of the money from the investment, and I wasn't ready to renegotiate yet, and I was just checking this out. Brendan's cool. He had founded and sold like 3 companies with Scaleform, Gaikai with Dave Perry, et cetera, et cetera. He knew it. He's a smart dude, very sharky in a good way. And I hold this thing up, and I was a believer in virtual reality the first time I did Dactyl Nightmare. I just
Back
wanted
in the mall.
Yeah, I just wanted to believe, even though it didn't work the first time. I never bought the virtual buy. I thought that was stupid. And so then I sit there, and it wasn't Doom 3 that I played. It was a Rage level. That was that kind of Kenneth Scott looking high tech stuff. And I remember looking over this ledge in VR, and I felt something. And for me, I have this kind of meter. Like, does this inspire me? Does this make me feel something? Which has helped me with my sensibilities with what I do, pacing, etc. And I looked down, and the quote I gave to Wired or somebody at the time was, "I gazed into the abyss, and the abyss also gazed into me." Like, I really felt something. And after looking at it for a minute, I put the phone down. I look at Brendan. I'm like, I want in on this. This is going to be big. So I put a chunk of money into that. Forgot about it for 2 to 3 years. Then one day, I'm in my home gym working out. I see the message, Oculus acquired by Facebook, and I'm like,
well,
my other friend who'd invested as well starts texting me, and we start going, and we're like, okay, and that was
life is good.
My friend in the Bay Area here started a place called Eatsa, by the way. It's self-serving quinoa. You should try it. It's supposed to be rather good.
It's very Bay Area.
Yeah, it's so Bay Area. I'm like, are we on the show Silicon Valley right now, right? And I'm like, is that going to play in Boise? I don't know. I think, quinoa, what's that? And I had sent him emails like, is this Oculus thing look kind of like, is this legit investing? Like, what series is this, blah, blah, blah. He's like, I don't know, dude. And so he still has that email, and he shows it to his Bay Area friends of like you mother. And it's one of those things, prior to that point, Ryan, any investment I'd ever put money into financially just crashed and burned. And so for this one, to really hit and this is for me, and this is, let's take the idea that I made a good amount of money over and put that over here.
Right.
The idea of my joking, like I have a saying, I know a good thing when I see it. Start Boss Key with Aryan, who's a Rockstar COO, Lauren, Raleigh on the up and up, like the people I associate with, the entertainment that I enjoy. I'd like to
trust your gut.
That's the thing is, you can quantify and listen to the quants and look at the data and look at the market research and all that. But at the end of the day, your gut is the thing that really will help drive a person's personal and professional life, right? Whether or not something's a good thing. And like when I first met Lauren, well, first off, she won this Miss Video Game competition years back, and she showed up on the blogs, and I was like, that's my next girlfriend. And then I built up confidence dating a lot in order to actually reach out to her. And then I saw her in her page, and I was like, she's a Counter-Strike pro player and everything like that. And I looked at the photos, and I'm like, oh my God, she's gorgeous. Like, she's completely out of my league. Oh my God. And so eventually I got up the cockiness to be like, what's up? How you doing? And then I called her and started talking to her, and she's so sweet and kind and nice. And then I found out she's from Louisiana, and I met her family out of New Orleans. And her family is just like open arms, loving, wonderful, great people. And I'm like, oh, it makes sense now. Like it's.
You got to marry the family too.
That's really, dude. Like I lucked out with that. Like they're the sweetest, kindest people, and we do crawfish boils, and I throw second line parades with them when we're in New Orleans, and I hire the band and everything, and they just, I always hug all of them, and we're all just like super close.
I know I'm starting to run out of time with you, but I got to come back to this trust in your gut thing, because it brings me back to a point. I always like to ask developers this, and I know you're going to have an opinion on it one way or the other, and that's, how do you feel about community feedback and integrating that into the development of a game? Because I always like to, I am of the mind where, this is about you, but just to set up the context, I thought the Mass Effect 3 thing was a fiasco, and I was all for BioWare. They're the artists. Mm-hmm. And so the way that whole thing went was, I hated how that whole thing went. What do you think as a person who trusts their gut, but also makes games and does have a community that supports you and you need to support them? How do you feel
it's a fine line, because you're not just dumping a product out there and saying "F you, take it."
Right.
You're dealing with a community that's going to wants to play your game. That you're on the third game and they're not happy with your ending. And if you can remind people that your game exists, I think it was a business decision at that point to keep Mass Effect 3 in kind of the zeitgeist to remind people about the game. So in that instance, commercially, it made sense for the artists to kind of bend and kind of give the people what they want. That goes back to Gears, man. Like chainsaw game, chainsaw gun. No, it was a shotgun game. That's where, when you got to the point with Gears 3, it's like, okay, let's just do a sawed-off shotgun. Let's just give them what they want, right?
Yeah.
That was the goal with that. One quick note, by the way, about the jadedness in general, in developers was, I remember real quick, back to the Oculus thing for a quick second, but we'll get back to community. I remember looking at that, and I remember the jaded programmers at the time, it's not high-res enough. It's not going to track well enough. I don't buy it. It's not going to happen. VR didn't work last time. I'm sitting here going, like, and I remember looking at my phone after seeing the Facebook thing, and I was sitting there going, like, so anyway, long story short, especially, as we get from 2006 to 2016 and beyond, your community is everything. And, you need to listen to them to a point, but you have to be careful at the point where it's an echo chamber of the tail wagging the dog.
Because you're only ever hearing from 1% or less of your audience,
yeah,
right?
well, now you have, people giving their opinion on YouTube and Twitch. People tweeting you violently. You have, Instagram. 8 million different social channels. That's why you need a community team that can help filter that stuff, as well as look at the data, listen to what the community feels, and make the gut call and communicate your reasoning behind it. Right. That's the big thing, is transparency. If you're as transparent as you can possibly be with your community and let them know your rationale for things and deliver it in the right way, they'll love you. I just get persnickety and curmudgeon-y on Twitter sometimes.
Did you ever intend to stay retired when you walked
At first,
away?
yes, because I was so burnt out. I was just so tired of.
Gears money was enough money to walk away at age 30-something.
Yeah, after the Chinese company came along, yeah.
Wow.
And so it was one of those situations where, again, it's Raleigh, dude. Like, you don't have to be a Zuckerberg out there. And but I basically had bought a house, and my wife and I were just chilling and playing Rust on our laptops. And eventually, it took me a year and a half to get the studio going, but after 6 months, I was climbing the wall. And the thing one of the many anecdotes I give is, we'd be sitting there eating dinner and learning how to cook in a house, because I used to just live in town and go to restaurants. Yeah. It was one of those situations where we'd be like, oh, how was your day? And we'd look at each other and go, you were there all day. You were there when the dog pooped in the backyard. You were there when I was playing my game. You were there when we were hanging out. It's like Chris Rock used to say, go get kidnapped, have some new happen to you. And so now, for me, at least personally, at the end of the day, Lauren's dealing with her own online community. She's playing games. She's, Twitch streaming now. She's, taking care of her dogs and whatnot. And then I'm, off doing my thing. And then we come back at the end of the day. How's your day? Blah, blah, blah. And it gives a couple, it's important. I bring her everywhere that I go, travel-wise. But it's important to, for people and relationships and friendships to go off and have stuff happen and be like, oh my God, I saw on social media you went to Italy. How was that? That kind of stuff. And it's one of the many, many things I've learned through the various relationship falling that I've done in order to learn balance.
So at one, you build up a studio. What comes first, the I need to get back to work, or the Lawbreakers? I've got an idea for a game.
The idea. So I alluded to this in the panel. A lot of what came through and what the current game is with the gravity, shooting in 0G and the movement and whatnot, came out of reading Leviathan Wakes, which was the book series that later became The Expanse on Sci-Fi. And there's a lot of the elements of what would happen if you were in a perfect 0G environment and you fired a high caliber weapon. It'd be Sandra Bullock with the fire extinguisher, or Wally. That's what happens, right? And so, when this came from me doing 0G many years ago, the plane that does parabolas, and that sensation of actually experiencing micro and then zero gravity. And and this whole generation doesn't remember Morpheus, the UT map, or Ziggurat Vertigo from Quake. And so now, if I can take the idea of variable gravity with all these characters in this new world order that's still an arena shooter, but for a new generation, and what happens if I blind fire a rocket through a zero gravity zone and propel myself and then luck out and accidentally blow up the enemy behind me, those kinds of moments. That's kind of what we're gunning for now, and a lot of that was kind of inspired by the stuff in that book series.
So is it a hero shooter? Is it a MOBA? Because none of us have gotten to play it just
Here's
yet.
The thing is, even UT had characters. Quake 3 had clowns and There's always been characters in these games. The thing is, are you getting your abilities from the things you find in the environment, or are they built into your kind of character? And I don't want us to be lumped in with all the character-based shooters out there, because MOBAs I respect, but we're not a MOBA. What we are is a first-person shooter with all sorts of movements you haven't seen in a game before, with a soft R type of rating that's more of the Tarantino type version of these super cartoony-looking games that has game types and moments that are built to build tension and excitement. my designer who designed the game types, we don't just do CTF, we don't just do TDM. We have this mode where you capture a battery, it charges when you bring it to your base. Once it gets to 100%, you have to hold it for 20 seconds, you score a point. At any given point, the enemy can steal the battery out of your base. So it's kind of like a variant on one flag CTF that ends with, it's almost always 2-1, the first to two team to 2 wins, with people screaming in the test lab to the point where our neighbors at our office hate our guts. And other modes, like there are twists on like domination and things like that. Like the order that I gave to my designer for is like, give me drama. Learning to love American football and how it can end with just a kick or a fumble or an interception. That's the stuff that we're seeding the game with, and those great animated GIFs and YouTube moments that hopefully will make it a success, and tonally not looking like the other games, as well as yielding just moments and drama and potentially making the leap eventually, hopefully, to some sort of esporty type thing. But I'm not even going to try and that chicken right now.
Is it fair to call it a spiritual successor to UT?
I'd say it's what's going to look like a mature rated spiritual successor to Quake and Unreal Tournament, but with the depth and longevity and drama that is deemed necessary for 2016 and beyond. You got to have your progression systems and your variables and unlocks and all that kind of stuff, right?
I forgot to ask you too. I got to figure, when you walk away from Epic and word gets out, your phone's blowing up at that point, right? With people looking to hire you?
Not hire, just my industry friends I've known for 20 years going, what the right?
Wait, but you're telling me people like Microsoft or EA or Sony or anybody isn't saying, Cliff, we hear you're available. We'd love to have a meeting with you to talk about.
One of the, who's always been amazing to me is Phil Spencer. Like when the Gears IP was sold, he was the first one to call me and tell me, and Phil is such just a rock star. I have so much respect for him.
He's a real gamer. He's a good guy.
He's a great guy. And so, some people reached out, but I think they all knew, like, I wanted like just be left alone for a little while.
Yeah.
And then eventually once I had the idea gestating, then and Ophir's like, hey, you want to do? I'm just like, just don't call me. Like there's a time where he'd call me from the agency and I just go ignore, and be like, hey, what's up? You ready to work yet? Nope. Picks up beer, picks up Kindle, sits at pool with dog. And so then eventually we did what we called the bake sale, where I had like my little leather-bound notebook with all of the ideas of the game I wanted to do. And it was like, it wound up being this kind of fun, dramatic prop where, went to Paris and to Ubisoft, put the thing down, like, I want to make another billion-dollar IP. You in? Go to EA. Even met with Mark Pincus at Zynga, and he was interesting. And then, I would talk to Activision, I talked to 2K, I talked to, all of the existing guard. And when it came to who wanted to come to what terms we wanted to come to, this crazy Korean company came out of nowhere and ponied up, and that's why Nexon wanted
a company that's only ever they're known for MMOs. And
like Kart Rider and stuff like that, right? And one of the big things that I've learned in life, and Jason Rubin himself taught me this, is past failure as success is not an indication of future failure and success. Just because virtual reality had never worked before doesn't mean it won't work now. Just because no one's ever made a PvE free-to-play game that does well, it turns out that Warframe is that and does well. So a dinosaur game. Dinosaur games largely didn't work until Ark came along, and now everyone wants to make a dinosaur game. So it's like who's going to be the first one to actually do it to make everyone copy? Brandon Beck over at Riot pitched League to EA. And allegedly, the story goes, the urban legend, he was laughed out of the room. Like, that's too complex, that'll never work. After Brandon and his crew, they saw the success of the World of Warcraft mod, Warcraft 3 mod, of the kind of 3-lane MOBA, and like, let's do our own version of that.
Yeah.
And now here they are, doing amazing.
Yeah. So you partnered up with a company that, because they're gonna leave you alone, right? They're gonna let you do your thing.
I mean, they gotta get their ducks in a row to market the hell out of the game. I think tonally, once you see that marketing, it's gonna be really apparent we're more the Suicide Squad type of the first-person shooter as opposed to the Avengers and Ant-Man.
Yeah.
And but it's one of those things, like they're not telling me like you can't make a character with green hair because that won't sell in Croatia or some crap, like whatever. Like they're not getting in the way of that. They're trusting that we, between Ariane, Trammell, Chris Milkey, we have like 5,000 collective years of game development. Like, fund the studio, get the out of the way, and show up and market it when the time comes, and hopefully step 3 profit.
So the last question I have for you, Cliff, is we've clearly established you will follow your gut. You did very well on investments over the years. So my question I have is, how long do you think you'll keep making games?
I got at least 1 or 2 in me.
Yeah?
Yeah, and it's one of those things eventually, you're a bolder man than I am. You have a 4-year-old, you said a kid, and I'm pumping the brakes on that as long as I can, because as much as I love kids and my nieces and nephews and everything, they're a lot of work. And I tell my wife, I'm like, what do we like right now? Video games, movies, travel, sleep,
doing what you want when you want,
alcohol, nice dinners, time with friends, and when you have, from what I understand about having a child, it's one of the most rewarding things you can do. But it's like I say, anything worth doing in life is work. It's a lot of work, man. And so eventually, if I get around to doing that, that's depending on what happens with Bleszinski. It could go either direction. I want Lawbreakers to do amazing. If that does amazing, maybe we'll explore other options in regards to games and things like that. Who knows? But you can't predict what's coming next in this industry a year or two out. You're lucky if you can do 6 months.
Right.
VR may come out and completely change the world, or could flop this time. No one's fully sure. So it's one of those things that, for me personally, I'm not like, I told Ariane, I'm like, dude, I'm having too much fun. Like, I love pitching a weapon or a character and then seeing a sketch for it 2 days later. I want to see cosplayers with this game. I want to see the tattoos. I want couples coming up to me telling me they met and fell in love online playing this game, blowing each other up. Like, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. Money's fine and great, be able to, eat and whatnot, but like, the magic of the studio and the culture of the environment and, trying to really not take in the gravitas of moving entire families across the country to come work on this random game idea I had, which, you can't let get to you. And, just ship something, the power of birthing, your digital baby,
So at some point, you're going to Marcus Phoenix it, and it's going to be you and Lauren on the beach, walk away from it all, and then in 25 years, I'll be sitting here, I'll be gray and doing this, and I'll be talking to J.D. Bleszinski.
It's one of those things, eventually maybe.
Cliff Bleszinski, thank you so much. The game, of course, is Lawbreakers. It's coming, you mentioned, sooner than we think, which is good news. It's coming to Steam exclusively. Yep. It will be, it is a fast action shooter with all sorts of gravity craziness.
Variable gravity, character-based, awesome weapons, kind of an M-rated type, Quentin Tarantino type game. We actually curse and have jibbing in the game. And it's going to be on Steam, and it's not going to be free to play anymore.
Excellent.
It's got to be a gray area between free to play and sleazy and $60 trade-ins. So hopefully we're going to try and find that.
Look forward to your solution.
Cool.
Cliff, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For much more from IGN Unfiltered, we do these every month, sitting down with the best and brightest in the industry. Please look them up on YouTube, IGN, iTunes, etc. And we'll see you next time.